October 5, 1944, above Asselt, Netherlands. 5 pilots from No. 401 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, orbited at altitude, their Spitfire Mark 9 shimmering in the afternoon light. Squadron leader Smith noticed at first a flash of silver plunging toward Nîmes at unbelievable speed. No propeller, no familiar outline, just a shard of metal slicing through the air faster than anything the Canadians had ever encountered in battle. The Me-262 jet fighter rolled sharply, its exhaust trailing faint ribbons against the violet sky. For 3 years, Allied intelligence had murmured about German jet development, but speculation meant nothing compared to the machine now tearing past at more than 500 miles per hour. Smith keyed his radio, directing Flight Lieutenant Davenport, Flight Lieutenant Everard, Flying Officer Me, and Flying Officer Sinclair into intercept positions. What followed was aviation history's first verified jet fighter shootdown by gunfire in aerial combat. More importantly, it marked the first fracture in what German propaganda had proclaimed would be an unbeatable miracle weapon. The Messerschmitt 262 Schwalbe had just exposed its fatal weakness. Within months, American P-51 Mustang pilots would exploit that weakness, turning it into organized hunting tactics that would render the world's first operational jet fighter nearly ineffective despite its groundbreaking technology. The psychological shock of that first encounter swept through Allied fighter units across Europe. Pilots who saw Me-262s immediately understood that the nature of air combat had shifted. Captain Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group, stationed at RAF Leiston, listened to the intelligence briefings with rising unease. The German jet could reach 540 miles per hour in level flight while the Mustang peaked at 437 miles per hour. In a direct pursuit, the Me-262 was simply unreachable. The numbers were harsh and unmistakable. If the Luftwaffe fielded these jets in real quantities, with enough fuel and competent airmen, the strategic bombing offensive crippling German industry could suffer disastrous losses. The 17 flying fortresses lumbering through flak-filled skies at 180 miles per hour would be helpless targets for pilots and aircraft that could strike from any direction and disappear before escorts could react. For the first time since gaining air superiority over Europe, Allied commanders faced the possibility of surrendering it. But the Me-262's pioneering design contained flaws rooted in the very nature of early jet propulsion. The Junkers Jumo 004 axial flow turbojet engines represented a technological leap forward, yet they were crude and temperamental. Each engine produced roughly 1,980 pounds of thrust at 8,700 revolutions per minute, consuming J2 synthetic fuel refined from brown coal at twice the rate of piston engine fighters. The turbine blades, fabricated from a chromium-molybdenum alloy because Germany lacked sufficient high-temperature nickel and chromium, operated at heat levels that caused rapid thermal deformation. Under wartime conditions, the Jumo 004B engines required inspection after roughly 10 hours of use, with complete replacement usually necessary after about 25 hours. This meant that after a mere 3 or 4 missions, Me-262s needed new engines, causing logistical nightmares German ground crews could never fully overcome. The engine's throttle behavior created immediate tactical hazards. Unlike piston motors that reacted almost instantly, the Jumo 004 responded sluggishly. Advancing the throttle too abruptly dumped excess fuel into the combustion chambers before airflow could increase, causing jet pipe temperatures to surge and turbine blades to burn out. Pilots had to handle the throttles with near-surgical care, making gradual adjustments and waiting for the engines to catch up. In combat, where instant reactions often determine survival, this lethargy turned the fastest aircraft in the world into an easy target at critical moments. Takeoff and landing magnified these flaws into lethal vulnerabilities. With a wing loading of 294 kilograms per square meter, far higher than any contemporary fighter, the jet required takeoff speeds above 110 miles per hour and similar speeds for landing. During the crucial acceleration run, once the brakes were released, the Me-262 needed nearly 30 seconds to reach flying speed, crawling down the runway while its engines struggled to build thrust at low airflow. For those 30 seconds, the jet was essentially defenseless, moving straight ahead at a predictable pace, unable to maneuver or escape. Any Allied fighter that intercepted in Me-262 during takeoff had a nearly stationary target with almost no chance to evade. Landing approaches created the same danger. As Me-262 pilots descended toward their airfields with fuel nearly gone after 60 to 90-minute sorties, they were forced to slow, deploy flaps and gear, and fly straight and level, all while becoming extremely predictable. The engines that made the jet formidable at altitude became liabilities in these low-speed phases. Intelligence officers at 8th Air Force Headquarters in England analyzed the situation systematically throughout late summer and early autumn of 1944. Photo reconnaissance missions pinpointed Me 262 bases at Ullum, Hopsten, Rhein, Lechfeld, and Munich Rhein. Study of gun camera footage from early encounters confirmed the jet's tremendous high-speed strengths but also its crippling low-speed weaknesses. Allied analysts realized that Me-262 pilots, having burned most of their fuel during high-speed interceptions, were forced to return to these specific airfields. They could not divert because the specialized J-2 fuel required for the engines was stocked only at designated bases. This geographic limitation presented an opening. If Mustang fighters could linger near known jet bases, they could ambush Me-262s during their most exposed moments. If the tactic required patience, fuel endurance, and pilots willing to fly directly into some of the most heavily defended airspace in Germany, but it offered the only reliable method for propeller-driven fighters to engage jets on anything approaching equal terms. The Luftwaffe recognized this vulnerability immediately after the first jet losses. Commanders installed extensive flak alleys along approach corridors to Me-262 bases, positioning 88mm guns, 37mm automatic cannon, and quad 20mm systems to create curtains of fire that any attacking fighter had to penetrate. They assigned their most advanced piston engine fighters, the Fowler-Wolf FW-190D and the rare TAR-152H, to provide top cover during jet takeoffs and landings. Flight schedules were randomized when possible to prevent Allied fighters from predicting launch times. Some bases deployed decoy aircraft to lure attackers into flak traps. The Autob barn near several jet bases was modified into emergency landing strips with camouflaged parking areas in adjacent woods, allowing Me-262s to operate from locations that Allied intelligence had not identified. Despite these defensive measures, the fundamental tactical problem remained unsolvable. Me-262s had to take off and land, and during those phases, they became defenseless regardless of how many guns defended them. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361 Fighter Group became intimately familiar with the Me-262 threat during missions over Germany in early October 1944. The 21-year-old pilot from Detroit had encountered a jet on a previous sortie and filed detailed intelligence reports describing its capabilities. On October 7, Drew was grounded and facing disciplinary action for performing an unauthorized victory role. After a successful mission, his punishment vanished when intelligence reported a concentration of Me-262s at Akma Aerodrome in northwestern Germany. Drew's previous jet encounter made him the obvious choice to lead a fighter sweep against the base. He briefed his flight carefully, emphasizing that success required surprise, aggression, and accepting the risks of flying directly through German flak defenses. His wingman, 2nd Lieutenant Robert McCandless, would stay with him regardless of what happened. Drew's P-51 Mustang, coded E-2D and nicknamed Detroit Miss, lifted off from RAF Little Walden with full internal fuel and wing tanks, giving him nearly 4 hours of endurance. The weather over Germany that October afternoon was broken clouds with good visibility, perfect conditions for spotting aircraft against the ground. Drew led his flight toward Akma at 15,000 feet, scanning constantly for jet contrails or the telltale flash of sun on polished aluminum. As they approached the known jet base, he spotted them. Two Me-262s positioned on the runway, engines already running, preparing for takeoff. Drew pushed his throttle forward and dropped into a dive, building speed and losing altitude rapidly. The Me-262s began their takeoff roll just as Drew's Mustang screamed past 400 miles per hour in the dive. The lead jet, piloted by Oberfeld Wiebel Heinz Arnold, had reached perhaps 80 miles per hour when Drew opened fire from 800 YD, his 650 caliber machine guns converging on the accelerating target. Tracers walked up the runway and found the Me-262's right engine. Arnold's jet lurched as the engine disintegrated, but his airspeed was already too high to abort. The crippled Me-262 staggered into the air on one engine, completely unable to maintain altitude or accelerate, drew close to 400 yards and fired again, this time hitting the cockpit area. Arnold's jet rolled inverted and plunged into trees beside the runway, exploding on impact. The second Me-262, flown by Lieutenant Guard Cobbert, had witnessed Arnold's destruction and attempted to abort his takeoff, but the jet's poor throttle response and high landing speed made rapid deceleration impossible. Cobbert's aircraft was still rolling at high speed when Drew pulled out of his first attack and immediately repositioned for a second pass. McCandless called warnings about flak as German gunners found their range. 88 shells bursting around the attacking Mustangs in black puffs. Drew ignored the flak and dove again, firing a long burst into Cobbert's Me-262. As it attempted to turn off the runway, hits sparkled along the fuselage and both engines. The jet slowed, then erupted in flames as fuel tanks ignited. Cobbert managed to escape the burning wreck, but his aircraft was a total loss. In less than 2 minutes, Drew had destroyed two of Germany's most advanced fighters using tactics that would become standard doctrine for Allied pilots. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that technological superiority meant nothing during critical flight phases, and that aggression combined with precise timing could neutralize the Me-262 threat. Drew's gun camera jammed during the attack, providing no photographic evidence of his victories. His only witness, Manless, was hit by flak during their escape from ACMA and shot down, becoming a prisoner of war before he could corroborate Drew's claims. Without gun camera footage or witness statements, 8th Air Force Headquarters initially denied Drew's victory credits, a crushing disappointment after one of the war's most significant tactical achievements. Drew would not receive official recognition until 1983, nearly 40 years later, when German Luftwaffe archives were cross-referenced with American records. Luftwaffe Ace Georg Peter Ed, who had been scheduled to lead the Me-262 formation that day, but whose aircraft suffered mechanical problems, confirmed that he witnessed a yellow-nosed P-51 dive on the Me-262S and destroy both jets. Ada could not read the name Detroit Miss painted on the Mustang's nose from his position on the ground, but his testimony was sufficient. The United States Air Force awarded Drew the Air Force Cross on May 12, 1983. Presented by Secretary of the Air Force Vern Oregon. Drew and his wife were flown from Johannesburg, South Africa to the ceremony via C-141 Starlifter. He remains the first and only Allied pilot to shoot down two jet aircraft in a single mission while flying a propeller-driven fighter. That same October 7, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zimper of the 479th Fighter Group may have scored another Me-262 victory, though uncertainty remains. ZMP, one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced fighter leaders, attacked what he believed was a Bf-109 during a mission over Germany. His gun camera footage was ambiguous, showing an aircraft that could have been either a Messerschmitt 109 or an Me-262. Post-war analysis suggested it was likely a jet, but the victory was never definitively confirmed. What mattered more than the specific victory claims was the emerging pattern. American fighter pilots were discovering that Me-262s, despite their revolutionary speed, could be defeated through tactical innovation. The key was refusing to engage jets in their element, high-altitude, high-speed combat, and instead forcing engagements during vulnerable phases when speed advantage disappeared. Chuck Jagger encountered his first Me-262 exactly 1 month later on November 6, 1944, while leading a bomber escort mission near Acma, Germany. Jagger's P-51 named Glamorous Glen 3 after his wife Glen Ice was cruising at patrol altitude when he spotted Me-262s attempting to intercept the bomber formation. The jets made their pass with typical tactics, diving through the bomber stream at tremendous speed, firing briefly, then using their velocity advantage to zoom climb back to altitude before escort fighters could react. Jerger watched the jets disappear into clouds, apparently escaping clean. Standard doctrine said chasing M262s was futile, but Jerger made a calculated gamble. Those jets had to land somewhere, and they had to land soon because their fuel endurance was limited. He broke from the bomber formation and descended through the clouds, emerging at lower altitude near Acma airfield. Below him, Jerger spotted a lone Me-262 in the landing pattern, gear and flaps extended, speed reduced to perhaps 150 mph as it lined up on final approach. The German pilot, focused on his landing, apparently failed to spot the Mustang diving on him from above and behind. Jerger pushed his throttle full forward and trimmed for maximum dive speed. The P-51 accelerated rapidly in the descent. Jerger, using gravity to boost his speed above 450 miles per hour, he closed to 400 yards and opened fire, walking his tracers onto the Me-262's wings. Hits sparkled along the jet's left wing route and fuselage. The Me-262 pilot, probably wounded or killed by the initial burst, made no evasive maneuver. Jerger continued firing as he closed to point-blank range, pouring rounds into the jet's engines and cockpit. The Me-262's left wing folded upward. The jet rolled inverted and plunged into woods several hundred feet short of the runway threshold, exploding in a ball of orange flame. Jerger had no time to celebrate. Acma's defensive guns opened fire immediately, 88mm shells bursting around his Mustang as he screamed across the airfield at high speed and treetop altitude. His only option was to fly straight down the runway, using speed to escape before the flak crews could adjust their aim. Tracers arced across the field from both sides. Some rounds fired from one side of the runway, actually hitting gun positions on the opposite side in the chaos. Jerger held his P-51 low and fast, cleared the far end of the airfield, and pulled up hard, diving for the safety of a nearby valley. He had survived one of the most dangerous tactical situations in air combat, attacking an enemy airfield in daylight at low altitude, but he had also proven that Me-262s could be hunted and killed. Jerger later described the engagement with characteristic understatement. "First time I saw a jet, I shot it down. Not very sportsmanlike, but what the hell?" Through late 1944 and into 1945, American fighter pilots refined their anti-jet tactics based on hard-won experience and carefully analyzed gun camera footage. The P-51 Mustang proved ideal for the mission because of its exceptional range and endurance. A Mustang with full internal fuel and two wingdrop tanks could remain airborne for more than 7 hours, giving pilots the ability to loiter near known jet bases for extended periods. When jets appeared, Mustang pilots used altitude advantage to dive on them, trading height for speed. In the dive, a P-51 could briefly approach or even exceed 500 miles per hour, enough to catch Me-262s during their most exposed moments. Timing was critical. Attacking jets during their takeoff roll required spotting them early and positioning for attack before they reached flying speed. Catching them on landing approach required patience to wait for the perfect moment when the jet was committed to its approach path with gear and flaps deployed. Fighter pilots developed an intimate knowledge of Me-262 operational patterns through persistent observation and intelligence analysis. They learned that jets typically operated in morning and late afternoon windows when visibility was good, but sun angles complicated visual acquisition for defenders. They noted that Me-262s often flew in pairs or small formations, rarely alone, meaning that destroying one jet frequently provided opportunities to attack others. They understood that German pilots, constrained by fuel limitations, could not wave off landing approaches and go around for another attempt. Once an Me-262 committed to landing with low fuel remaining, the pilot had no choice but to continue regardless of threats. This psychological factor gave attacking Mustang pilots a crucial advantage. The jet pilot knew he was exposed but could not abort. The Mustang pilot could press his attack with confidence that his target would not suddenly accelerate and escape. The Luftwaffe's defensive measures grew increasingly sophisticated in response to these tactics, but fundamental problems remained unsolvable. Flak alleys became denser with some approach corridors defended by more than 100 guns of various calibers. Fighter cover increased with FW-190D and TA-152H pilots ordered specifically to engage Allied fighters near jet bases. Regardless of tactical situation, Me-262 pilots received instructions to vary their approach patterns, making random turns and altitude changes to complicate interception. Some bases deployed smoke generators to obscure the field during landing operations. Despite these efforts, the mathematical reality could not be changed. M262ES needed specific bases with specific fuel supplies and could only remain airborne for limited durations. Allied fighters could saturate the areas around jet bases, making some engagement nearly inevitable. February 25, 1945 produced one of the most devastating demonstrations of these tactics when Mustangs of the 55th Fighter Group surprised an entire staff of Me-262s at Geilstad Airfield during takeoff operations. The attack was perfectly timed with P-51s arriving just as multiple jets began their takeoff rolls. In the chaos that followed, American pilots destroyed 6 Me-262s on the ground or during takeoff with several more damaged. The losses represented a significant percentage of operational jets available to that unit. German records indicate the Me-262s belonged to the ill-fated KFKA-54A bomber unit that had been re-equipped with jets, but whose pilots lacked adequate fighter training. The 55th Fighter Group's attack demonstrated that concentrated fighter sweeps against jet bases during known operational periods could achieve dramatic results, though at considerable risk. Several Mustangs were damaged by defensive fire during the engagement, and the tactical success depended on achieving complete surprise. The psychological impact of these defeats on German jet pilots was profound and cumulative. Me-262 pilots were elite aviators, carefully selected and extensively trained, often veterans with considerable combat experience. They understood their technological advantages and initially approached missions with justified confidence in their aircraft's capabilities. Repeated losses during takeoff and landing phases, however, created an atmosphere of dread surrounding these critical moments. Pilots knew that every departure and return carried significant risk of ambush. The knowledge that Allied fighters might be waiting, that there was no escape option once committed to landing, that fuel gauges showed empty tanks created psychological pressure that affected performance and decision-making. The March 18, 1945 raid on Berlin illustrated both the Me-262's potential and its ultimate inability to change the war's outcome. A total of 1,221 Allied bombers escorted by 632 fighters attacked the German capital in what would be the last great air battle over Germany. Luftwaffe commanders assembled 37 Me-262s from Jakobswade 7 for a coordinated attack on the bomber formations, the largest jet force yet committed to a single mission. Lieutenant G. A. Wegmann led his squadron in a loose formation toward the incoming bombers, and he and his wingmen fired R-4M unguided rockets for the first time in operational use. The 50mm rockets, carried in underwing racks of 12 per aircraft, were designed to detonate near bombers, destroying them with blast and fragmentation without requiring precise aim. Wegmann's rockets slashed into a formation of 60 B-7s, and observers reported multiple bombers hit and falling. Other Me-262 Pilots pressed attacks with conventional 30mm cannon, their speed allowing them to make multiple passes before escorts could react effectively. The engagement was brief but intense. German pilots claimed 12 bombers and 1 fighter shot down, though United States records indicate 8 heavy bombers were actually lost along with 3 Me-262s destroyed in air combat. The discrepancy between claims and actual losses illustrated the common wartime pattern of overclaiming due to combat confusion. Even accepting German claims at face value, the jets destroyed less than 1% of the attacking force while the massive bomber formation reached its target and delivered its ordnance. The strategic bombing campaign continued unaffected. 5 American fighter pilots failed to return and dozens of bomber crew members were killed or became prisoners. But the mission was considered a success, complete success by Allied planners. Adolf Galland, Germany's former general of fighters who had been dismissed after disputes with Hermann Göring over fighter strategy, formed Jagdverband 44 in February 1945 as an elite Me-262 unit commanded by and composed of Germany's most experienced aces. The roster read like a who's who of Luftwaffe legends, pilots with hundreds of combined victories. The unit was given priority for aircraft, fuel, and support, representing Germany's last attempt to field jet fighters in meaningful numbers with optimal conditions. Galland himself flew combat missions, scoring victories with both cannon and the R-4M rockets. Other pilots reported successes against bombers and even against escorting fighters when conditions favored jet tactics. Yet Jagdverband 44's operational life was measured in weeks, not months. Allied bombing of bases forced constant relocation. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft for days at a time. Engine reliability problems meant that half the assigned jets were typically unserviceable, awaiting spare parts or engine replacements. The statistical reality of Me-262 operations revealed the gap between theoretical capability and practical effectiveness. German records indicate approximately 1,443 Me-262s were manufactured during the war. Of those manufactured, only around 200 to 300 ever saw combat operations. The remainder were destroyed on the ground by bombing, lost during training, or rendered unserviceable by maintenance problems. At no point did the Luftwaffe have more than 50 Me-262s operationally ready simultaneously, and typical daily availability was closer to 25 aircraft. This force faced Allied fighter strength exceeding 5,000 aircraft at any given time, plus thousands more bombers. The mathematics were insurmountable. Me-262 pilots claimed approximately 542 Allied aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, though verification of these claims shows the usual wartime overclaiming by all sides. Post-war analysis by American researchers suggested actual losses to Me-262s were substantially lower. Allied forces destroyed Me-262s at rates exceeding German production and training capabilities. American records credit P-51 Mustangs with 92.5 confirmed M262 shootdowns. Though this number includes aircraft destroyed on the ground and during takeoff or landing, not just air-to-air engagements. The 357th Fighter Group, Chuck Jagger's unit, led American forces with 18.5 confirmed jet kills. The 55th Fighter Group claimed 17, while the 78th and 339th Fighter Groups, each credited with 15. British forces, particularly flying Hawker Tempests and Spitfires, claimed an additional dozen jet kills. The cumulative effect was that Me-262 losses exceeded replacements and the operational force steadily declined despite production continuing until Germany's surrender. German ACE pilots who flew the Me-262 offered mixed assessments of its effectiveness in post-war interviews. Georg Peter Ida, who scored 12 kills in the jet, including 9 P-51s, acknowledged that the aircraft's speed made high-altitude bomber interceptions relatively safe, but that Allied counter measures increasingly negated this advantage. Walter Dahl, credited with 11 jet victories, including 6 Mustangs, emphasized that fuel limitations and engine reliability problems restricted tactical options to the point where the jet's theoretical superiority became largely irrelevant in practical operations. Heinrich Barr with 16 Me-262 kills from his total of 240 career victories stated flatly that the jet arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. France shall the type's probable top ace, with 17 kills including 6 4-engine bombers and 10 P-51s, was killed in action in April 1945. But his earlier reports emphasized the aircraft's inability to engage maneuvering fighters effectively due to its high approach speeds and wide turning radius. The tactical lessons learned from Me-262 operations influenced post-war jet fighter development worldwide. Allied engineers studied captured jets intensively, testing them at facilities in the United States and Britain. They confirmed that the basic design was sound, but that engine technology remained the critical limiting factor. Early American jets like the Lockheed P-80 and the Republic F-84 and Soviet designs like the MiG-15 incorporated solutions to problems identified in the Me-262. Longer engine life, better throttle response, improved fuel efficiency, and stronger airframes addressed the specific vulnerabilities that Allied fighters had exploited. American pilots who successfully engaged Me-262s became recognized experts within the fighter community, their combat reports studied carefully by intelligence officers and training instructors. Beyond Urban Drew and Chuck Jagger, dozens of other pilots scored jet kills through persistent application of the tactics developed through hard experience. These pilots shared common characteristics, including exceptional eyesight, precise gunnery skills, aggressive temperaments, and willingness to accept risks that more cautious pilots avoided. Attacking jet bases through dense flak required courage bordering on recklessness. Yet these pilots repeatedly flew such missions because they understood the strategic importance of neutralizing the jet threat. The human cost of these engagements affected both sides severely. American fighter pilots killed during attacks on jet bases died far from home, often in fiery crashes after flak damage. Their bodies sometimes never recovered from crash sites in Germany. German Me-262 pilots, the elite of the Luftwaffe, were irreplaceable assets lost at rates that Germany's shrinking training program could not sustain. Each dead or captured German jet pilot represented hundreds of hours of training, millions of Reich marks, and investment and tactical experience built over years of combat. The stress contributed to errors in judgment, accidents during takeoff and landing, and declining combat effectiveness even among experienced aviators. The infrastructure supporting Me-262 operations collapsed progressively through early 1945 as Allied armies advanced into Germany and strategic bombing intensified. Specialized jet fuel became increasingly scarce as refineries were bombed or captured. Replacement engines already in short supply due to production bottlenecks became unavailable when factories were destroyed or fell to advancing forces. Spare parts for airframes and systems disappeared from supply chains. Trained maintenance personnel were killed in bombing raids or reassigned to infantry units as Germany grew desperate for soldiers. Airfields themselves came under direct ground attack as front lines moved eastward. By April 1945, Me-262 units were operating from sections of Autobahn or improvised strips, hiding aircraft in woods and working with minimal supplies under constant threat of air attack. The final weeks of Me-262 operations in April and early May 1945 were characterized by sporadic sorties flown by scattered units operating independently as central command and control disintegrated. Individual pilots flew missions when fuel was available, often attacking targets of opportunity rather than executing coordinated operations. Some pilots chose to fly their jets to Allied-held territory and surrender rather than continuing hopeless combat. Others flew final missions knowing that return would be impossible due to fuel shortages or airfield capture. A few, including members of Band 44, flew combat until literally the final days of the war, achieving kills even as Germany's military structure collapsed completely. Post-war analysis by American and British aviation experts reached consensus that the Me-262 represented a revolutionary technological achievement that arrived too late to affect the war's outcome. Even if Hitler had not delayed production by demanding bomber variants, even if engine reliability had been better, even if more were produced, the fundamental strategic situation made the jet's impact limited. Germany in 1944 lacked fuel, lacked trained pilots, lacked air superiority necessary for safe operations, and faced overwhelming numerical disadvantage against Allied air forces. The Me-262 could not solve these problems regardless of its performance advantages. The legacy of the Me-262 versus Mustang engagements extended far beyond World War II, influencing air combat doctrine for generations. The fundamental principle that technological superiority does not guarantee tactical success became a case study taught at military MIs worldwide. The importance of exploiting enemy vulnerabilities rather than engaging strengths became embedded in fighter pilot training. The recognition that even revolutionary weapons systems have exploitable weaknesses informed military planning and procurement strategies throughout the Cold War and beyond. The specific tactics developed by American pilots to counter the Me-262 speed advantage using altitude to build speed in dives, timing attacks for vulnerable flight phases, and persistent patrolling of known enemy operating areas remained relevant as new generations of fighters with performance advantages emerged. Individual pilot accounts from the period provided rich detail about the psychological and tactical challenges of these engagements. Chuck Jagger in his autobiography and numerous interviews emphasized that destroying the Me-262 required accepting exceptional risk and making split-second decisions with imperfect information. He described the tension of loitering near German airfields, knowing that flak and enemy fighters would engage. The moment he attacked, the calculation required to time his dive for maximum speed at the critical moment, and the satisfaction of proving that American fighters could defeat the seemingly invincible jets. Urban Drew, after receiving his belated recognition in 1983, spoke about the frustration of having his victories denied for nearly 40 years due to lack of corroborating evidence, but also about the importance of the mission regardless of personal recognition. The engineering lessons from Me-262 operations directly influenced the development of the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, which entered service just as World War II ended. Lockheed engineers studied captured Me-262s extensively, examining their engines, airframes, and systems to understand both successes and failures. The P-80's design incorporated longer-lasting engines with better throttle response, addressing the most critical Me-262 weakness. Improved fuel efficiency extended range beyond the Me-262's 650 m maximum. Stronger landing gear reduced the accident rate that plagued German jet operations. Better cockpit visibility enhanced pilot situational awareness during vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. Soviet designers similarly studied Me-262 technology with captured aircraft and engines shipped to research facilities, where they were extensively tested. The information gleaned influenced designs. Like the MiG-15 and Yak-15, though Soviet engineers also incorporated British engine technology obtained through espionage and technology transfer. The global proliferation of jet fighter knowledge that resulted from Me-262 analysis accelerated the transition from piston to jet propulsion that dominated the late 1940s and 1950s. Within 10 years of World War II's end, propeller-driven fighters had become obsolete for frontline service, replaced by jets in virtually every air force worldwide. The final accounting of Me 262 operations reveals an aircraft that achieved tactical successes, but strategic failure. Individual pilots scored impressive kill totals, and specific missions demonstrated the jet's capabilities when conditions favored it. However, the cumulative impact on Allied air operations was minimal. Strategic bombing continued unabated. Allied fighters maintained air superiority and ground forces advanced into Germany with effective air support throughout. The resources devoted to Me 262 development and production, including scarce materials, manufacturing capacity, and skilled labor, might have produced more conventional fighters that could have been operated more effectively with available fuel and pilot training. The story of German pilots flaunting their jets until Mustang aces caught them during vulnerable moments is ultimately a story about the limits of technological solutions to strategic problems. Germany developed the world's first operational jet fighter, achieving a genuine breakthrough that should have provided significant tactical advantages. Yet this achievement could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in numbers, resources, fuel availability, trained personnel, and strategic position. American and Allied pilots flying less advanced aircraft but supported by overwhelming industrial capacity, comprehensive training systems, reliable logistics, and sound tactical doctrine defeated the technological marvel through persistence, innovation, and professional excellence. In the final analysis, the Me 262 stands as one of aviation history's most fascinating might have been an aircraft that demonstrated the future but arrived too late to change the past. Its combat record, while impressive in specific engagements, was ultimately insufficient to affect the war's outcome. The American pilots who developed and executed tactics to counter the jet threat earned their place in aviation history not through technological superiority, but through tactical excellence, courage, and refusal to concede advantage to an apparently invincible opponent. Their success affirmed the principle that human factors, training, doctrine, leadership, and resolve, can overcome technological shortcomings when applied effectively. The shift from German confidence to Allied superiority in the jet versus Mustang duels unfolded in less than a year, from October 1944, when the first Me 262 was shot down, to May 1945, when the final jet missions ended. This swift reversal emerged not from any single cause, but from the combined impact of methodical exploitation of Me 262 weaknesses along with unremitting pressure that kept the Luftwaffe from ever establishing stable jet operations. Every Me 262 lost during takeoff or landing was one fewer available for bomber interception. Every pilot killed or captured removed invaluable skill and experience. Every successful Allied strike on jet airfields forced German units to operate more widely dispersed and with reduced coordination. The last months of Me 262 service saw German pilots fighting with mounting desperation as their tactical circumstances worsened. Fuel shortages restricted missions to only the most essential targets. Engine troubles kept aircraft grounded for long intervals. Allied fighter patrols made each takeoff and landing a potential death trap. Base evacuations disrupted organization and morale. Yet some airmen continued flying combat sorties until the war's final moments, displaying extraordinary bravery and professionalism despite hopeless odds. These pilots knew victory was impossible, but flew regardless, driven by varying blends of duty, honor, and hope that their efforts might still carry meaning. The story ended not with a climactic final clash, but with a slow disintegration as Germany's military structure collapsed entirely in early May 1945. Me 262s were left behind on airstrips, hidden in forests to avoid capture, or destroyed by their own crews to keep them from advancing armies. A few were ferried to Allied lines and surrendered. Most simply ceased flying as fuel supplies vanished and maintenance became unattainable. The jets that once promised to sweep Allied bombers from German skies concluded their careers scattered across the Reich, mute reminders of the gulf between technological promise and operational reality. The Mustang pilots who had hunted them returned home when the war ended, their task completed, the jet threat defeated by tactics that proved superior to raw innovation.